15 years after divorcing his wife without realizing she was pregnant, Gregory Whitmore got a call he never expected. Her voice was calm, too calm. And what she said next cracked the foundation of the life he'd built. Greg thought the worst call he'd ever get was from his lawyers, until his ex-wife's number flashed on his screen after 15 years of silence, and she said, "They tried to take Sienna." He didn't know who Sienna was, didn't know he had twin daughters, didn't know his business partner had been running human trafficking operations under his company's name, but he was about to lose everything finding out. The only question left was whether he'd expose the monster in time, or whether the girls he'd just discovered would disappear before he got the chance to be their father. Before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and comment what time it is that you're watching this video. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's begin. Greg had built a kingdom on certainty, on control. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not his board, not his name, not even his legacy. He ended the call, left the penthouse, and headed for the one place he had spent 15 years pretending didn't exist: the past. He remembered Danielle the way you remember a fire, too bright to stare at, too fierce to forget. Their marriage had burned hot, fast, and left behind more than ash. She'd been elegance and edge, ambition wrapped in empathy. The last time he saw her, she wore a white silk blouse and eyes full of goodbye. He had called it closure. She had called it survival. The morning of their divorce had been strangely quiet. She'd folded his clothes with the same grace she once used to close billion-dollar deals. Back then, Greg admired how she could bring calm into chaos, how she made homes out of hard things. He'd been too busy trying to build towers to notice the one thing that mattered most was quietly walking away, carrying his daughters with her. Danielle had never called him. Not for help, not for apologies, not even for justice, until now. And if she was reaching out after all this time, it meant something was wrong. Very wrong. 15 years earlier, Greg had signed the divorce papers without looking back. He didn't believe in regret. He believed in clean breaks. But what he didn't know, what he never stayed long enough to see, was that Danielle Reyes Whitmore was already carrying more than her pride when she walked out that door. He'd told himself it was the right call, that they'd grown in different directions, that ambition and intimacy couldn't coexist in the same life. He'd been building an empire. She'd been building a home. And in the end, neither could live in the other's world. So he let her go. Signed his name. Shook the lawyer's hand. Moved into a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a city that never slept but somehow never felt awake either. And for 15 years, he convinced himself he'd made the right choice. Until the call. It came on a Wednesday. Greg was in his corner office on the 47th floor of Whitmore Tower, mid-sentence in a strategy meeting with his executive board. Richard Maddox sat across from him, leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man who owned half of what they were discussing. The others, vice presidents, senior directors, people whose salaries could buy small countries, waited for Greg's next words like disciples at an altar. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. He always ignored calls during board meetings. It buzzed again. Greg's assistant knew better than to let anything through unless it was urgent. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. He almost declined it. But something, instinct maybe, or the ghost of a memory he'd buried long ago, made him pause. "Excuse me," he said, standing abruptly. The room went silent. Greg Whitmore didn't excuse himself. Ever. He walked to the far side of the office, turning his back to the glass conference table, and answered. "Whitmore." There was a pause, long enough that he almost hung up. Then her voice. "Hello, Greg." It had been 15 years, but he knew it instantly. Low. Steady. The kind of voice that didn't need to raise itself to command a room. The kind that once whispered his name in the dark and made him believe he was more than money and power. Danielle? Her name felt strange on his tongue, like a language he'd forgotten how to speak. I know this is unexpected, she said, no apology in her tone, no explanation, just fact. Greg's jaw tightened. He glanced over his shoulder. The board was pretending not to watch, but he could feel their eyes on him. It's been 15 years, he said quietly. I'd say that's more than unexpected. I need your help, Greg. He almost laughed. Almost. But there was something in her voice that stopped him. Not desperation. Danielle had never begged for anything in her life. But there was weight there. Gravity. Help with what? There's something you need to see. Danielle, I don't have time for... I wouldn't call if it wasn't important. That much, he believed. She'd walked away without asking for alimony, without taking a cent beyond what the prenup guaranteed. She'd rebuilt her life in silence, far from the spotlight that followed him everywhere. If she was calling now, after all this time, it wasn't for money. It wasn't for closure. It was something else. What is this about? He asked. Not over the phone. Her voice was calm, but he heard the edge beneath it. The same edge she used to get when closing deals with men twice her age who underestimated her. There are people watching, listening. I can't explain here. Greg's pulse quickened. People watching? Listening? It sounded paranoid. Danielle had never been paranoid. Where are you? She gave him an address. A gated estate in Coral Gables, 20 minutes outside the city. Quiet. Private. The kind of place people disappeared to when they wanted to be forgotten. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock, she said. Come alone. Danielle? I mean it, Greg. No security, no assistance, just you. He was about to argue, to demand answers, to tell her he didn't take orders, especially not from ghosts. But then she spoke again. Softer this time, almost hesitant. They're yours. The words hung in the air like smoke. Greg's throat tightened. What? Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. You'll understand when you see them. And then the line went dead. Greg stood there, phone still pressed to his ear, staring at nothing. His mind raced, trying to piece together what she'd meant. They're yours. Not it. They. Plural. His hand trembled. Just slightly. Just enough that he had to lower the phone before anyone noticed. He turned back toward the conference room. 14 faces stared at him, waiting. Richard raised an eyebrow, half smiling like he was in on a joke Greg hadn't heard yet. Everything all right? Richard asked. Greg didn't answer. He crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair and headed for the door. Greg? Richard stood now, frowning. We're in the middle of... Reschedule it. Reschedule? We've got the Singapore deal closing in. I said reschedule. His tone left no room for argument. The board exchanged glances. Greg had never walked out of a meeting. Not for illness, not for emergencies, not for anything. But he was walking out now. He pushed through the glass doors, past his assistant's desk, past the rows of cubicles filled with people who worked for him but didn't know him. His footsteps echoed on the marble floors as he headed for the private elevator at the end of the hall. His mind was still stuck on her voice. They're yours. He jabbed the elevator button. Once. Twice. The doors slid open, and he stepped inside, slamming his hand against the button for the ground floor. As the elevator descended, the city rising and falling outside the glass walls, Greg realized something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 15 years. Fear. Not the kind that came with bad earnings reports or hostile takeovers. Not the kind you could strategize around or buy your way out of. The kind that lived in the spaces between what you knew and what you'd been too afraid to ask. The elevator hit the ground floor with a soft chime. Greg stepped out into the lobby, ignoring the security guard's greeting, and walked straight into the blinding Miami sun. He didn't know what he was walking into. But for the first time in 15 years, Gregory Whitmore wasn't in control. and that terrified him more than anything Danielle could have said. The estate sat behind iron gates and a wall of bougainvillea, hidden from the road like a secret someone had decided to keep. Greg pulled up in his Aston Martin just before 2 o'clock, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath his tires. The property was pristine, manicured lawns, palm trees swaying in the breeze, a fountain trickling water into a stone basin. Quiet, private, the kind of place that cost money but didn't scream it. Nothing like the life he'd imagined for Danielle after the divorce. He cut the engine and sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel. His heart was doing something it hadn't done in years, racing without permission. They're yours. He still didn't know what that meant, didn't want to guess, didn't want to hope or fear or feel anything until he knew for certain. But deep down, in the part of him that had learned to bury inconvenient truths, he already knew. He got out of the car. Danielle was waiting on the front steps. 15 years had passed, but she looked almost exactly as he remembered. Older, yes. There were faint lines at the corners of her eyes, a few threads of silver in her dark hair. But she carried herself the same way she always had. Shoulders back, chin level. The kind of poise that didn't come from confidence alone, but from surviving things that should have broken her. She wore a simple linen dress, cream-colored, understated. No jewelry, except a thin gold bracelet on her wrist. She didn't smile, didn't move toward him, just stood there, watching him approach like she was measuring something she hadn't decided on yet. Greg stopped a few feet away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Danielle," he said finally. His voice sounded strange, too formal, like they were strangers meeting at a business lunch instead of two people who'd once promised each other everything. "Greg." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You came. You asked me to. I wasn't sure you would." He didn't know how to respond to that, so he didn't. The air between them felt heavy, not hostile, just loaded, like a conversation that had been paused 15 years ago and was only now being allowed to continue. "You said I needed to see something," Greg said quietly. Danielle's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes, something that looked like resolve. "I did." She turned toward the house, and for the first time, Greg noticed the two figures standing just inside the open doorway. His breath caught. They were teenagers, 15, maybe 16, tall and lean, with the kind of presence that suggested they knew exactly who they were and didn't need anyone's approval. One wore a maroon sweater and dark jeans. The other, a navy blouse and tailored slacks. Their hair was different. One wore hers in a sleek ponytail, the other in loose waves. But their faces were identical. And they were his. Greg's heart stopped. Not metaphorically, not poetically. It just stopped, the way clocks stop when the power cuts out. And when it started again, it came with a rush of something he couldn't name. Shock, disbelief, recognition so sharp it felt like being punched. They had his eyes, his jawline, the same angle to their cheekbones, the same tilt to their chins. Even the way they stood, weight shifted slightly to one side, arms crossed, guarded but unafraid, reminded him of himself at that age. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. The girl in maroon stared at him with cool, clinical detachment, like she was cataloging every detail and filing it away for later. The one in navy looked more curious, her head tilted slightly, lips pressed together like she was holding back a question. Danielle stepped aside, gesturing toward them with a simple, quiet authority. "Meet your daughters." The words landed like stones in still water. Greg's throat tightened. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Not anger, not denial, just silence. Because what could he possibly say? Danielle's voice was steady, calm, like she'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times and knew exactly how it would go. "Sienna," she said, nodding toward the girl in maroon. "And Savannah." Sienna, Savannah. The names echoed in his mind, unfamiliar and yet his. 15 years of birthdays he'd never attended. 15 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, first days of school. 15 years of a life that had happened without him. He looked at Danielle, searching her face for something. Anger, resentment, anything. But all he found was a quiet kind of certainty. She wasn't doing this to punish him. She was doing it because she had no other choice. 15 years, Greg said hoarsely. It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact that felt too large to hold. 15 years, Danielle echoed. Sienna's expression didn't change, but Savannah shifted slightly, uncrossing her arms. So, Savannah said, her voice clear and measured. You're him. Greg looked at her, at the way she held herself, at the skepticism in her gaze. I am, he said quietly. Good to know, Sienna said flatly. We were starting to wonder if you were real or just something Mom made up. Her tone was sharp, not cruel but not kind either. Greg didn't flinch. He deserved worse. Danielle stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. That's enough. Sienna shrugged. Savannah stayed silent, still watching Greg like he was a puzzle she hadn't figured out yet. Greg swallowed hard. His mind was racing, trying to catch up with what his eyes were telling him, trying to reconcile the life he thought he knew with the one standing in front of him. Why now? He asked, his voice rough. Why call me now? Danielle's expression darkened, just slightly, but enough that Greg noticed. Because someone's trying to hurt us, she said simply. And I think you're the only one who can stop them. Greg frowned. Hurt you? Who? I'll explain inside. She glanced at the twins, then back at him. But first, I need to know if you're in. Because once I tell you what's happening, there's no going back. Greg looked at the girls again, at Sienna's guarded stare, at Savannah's quiet curiosity, at the lives he'd missed without even knowing they existed. And for the first time in 15 years, Gregory Whitmore made a decision that had nothing to do with profit margins or power plays. I'm in, he said. Danielle nodded once, then turned and walked into the house. Sienna and Savannah followed without looking back, and Greg, after a long, shaken breath, did the same. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs, family photos. Danielle and the girls on vacation, at graduations, birthday parties, moments frozen in frames that told the story of a life Greg had never been part of. He stopped in front of one. The twins, maybe 5 years old, holding hands and grinning at the camera. He'd missed all of it, and there was no getting it back. Savannah glanced at him from across the room, her expression softer now, almost sympathetic. Welcome to the family, she said quietly. Greg didn't know if she meant it as comfort or condemnation, maybe both. They sat in Danielle's living room, a space that felt lived in but carefully maintained. Books lined one wall. A piano sat near the window, sheet music scattered across its top, the kind of home that held warmth without trying. Greg perched on the edge of an armchair, still too off balance to relax. Sienna and Savannah had disappeared upstairs, their footsteps fading into the quiet. Danielle sat across from him on the couch, a manila folder resting on the coffee table between them. She hadn't touched it yet. How long? Greg asked, breaking the silence. Danielle looked at him. How long have they been alive? Or how long have I been raising them alone? He flinched. I didn't know. I know. Her voice was even, not accusing, just factual. I left before I found out. By the time I did, you'd already moved on. New penthouse, new life. I wasn't going to be the ghost that dragged you back. Greg wanted to argue, to say he would have come back if he'd known. But would he have? 15 years ago, he'd been building an empire. He'd seen fatherhood as a distraction, marriage as a liability. He wasn't sure the man he'd been then deserved the chance Danielle had never given him. "I didn't call you here to relitigate the past," Danielle said quietly. She reached for the folder, fingers resting on its edge. "I called because someone is trying to destroy me, and I think you're the only person who can help me figure out who." Greg straightened. "What do you mean, destroy you?" Danielle opened the folder. Inside were printed emails, bank statements, legal documents marked with red annotations. She slid the first page toward him. "3 months ago, I started noticing irregularities in my accounts. Small withdrawals at first. A few hundred here, 1,000 there. I thought it was fraud, reported it to my bank. They investigated, found nothing." Greg scanned the statement. The transactions were clean. Too clean. Routed through offshore accounts, masked by shell companies with names that sounded legitimate but meant nothing. Then the legal threats started. Danielle continued. She handed him another document. A cease and desist letter from a law firm Greg didn't recognize, claiming Danielle had violated a non-compete agreement she'd never signed. "I haven't worked in corporate consulting in over a decade," Danielle said. "I run a nonprofit now. Family advocacy, women's shelters. Nothing that would trigger this kind of response." Greg frowned. "Who sent this?" "A firm called Apex Legal Group. I looked into them. They don't exist. Not officially. But their filings trace back to a parent company registered in the Cayman Islands." She pulled out another page. This one was a surveillance photo, grainy, taken from a distance. It showed Danielle walking Sienna and Savannah to their car outside a school. Greg's blood ran cold. "They're watching you. They've been watching me for weeks." Danielle's voice didn't waver, but Greg saw the tension in her jaw. "Following the girls, tracking my movements. I've switched phones twice, changed my routines, but they always know where I am." Greg set the photo down carefully, his mind already running through possibilities. Corporate espionage, personal vendetta, blackmail. But none of it made sense. Danielle had walked away from that world years ago. "Why you?" he asked. "What do they want?" Danielle met his eyes. "At first I thought it was random, someone trying to shake me down. But then I found this." She handed him a printout of a wire transfer. The sender was listed as MMX Holdings Limited. Greg stared at the name, his pulse quickening. "MMX," he said slowly. "Maddox." Danielle nodded. "Richard Maddox, your partner." Greg's jaw tightened. "That's impossible." "Is it?" "Richard and I have been building this company together for 20 years. He's been my right hand since the beginning. There's no reason he'd—" "Look at the dates," Danielle interrupted, her tone sharp now. "The first withdrawal happened 2 days after a board meeting where you announced a potential audit of overseas investments. The legal threat started a week after you mentioned tightening compliance." Greg looked at the timeline she'd mapped out. The correlation was there, subtle but undeniable. "Richard's been consolidating power for years," Danielle said quietly. "I did some digging. Quietly. He's got offshore accounts, shell companies, entire subsidiaries you don't know about. And every time you've gotten close to uncovering them, something's pulled you away. A crisis, a merger, a distraction." "That's circumstantial," Greg said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe." Danielle leaned forward. "But 3 weeks ago I received a message. Anonymous. It said, 'Stay quiet, or your daughters will pay the price.'" The words hit Greg like a physical blow. "You think Richard knows about them?" "I think someone close to you does," Danielle said, "and I think they're using the girls as leverage to keep me silent." Greg stood abruptly, pacing toward the window. His mind raced. Richard had been loyal, brilliant, indispensable. But loyalty didn't mean honesty, and brilliance made people dangerous when they turned. "If this is true," Greg said slowly, "then he's not just targeting me. If Richard is behind Danielle finished. He's positioning himself to take everything you've built, and we're collateral damage." Greg turned back to her, his expression hard. Do you have proof? Something concrete I can use? Danielle hesitated. Not yet. But I'm close. I've been tracking his transactions, cross-referencing his movements. If I'm right, there's a money trail that leads straight back to him. I just need time. Greg nodded, his jaw set. Then we'll find it. Together. For the first time since he'd arrived, Danielle's expression softened. Just slightly. Thank you, she said quietly. Greg didn't respond. He just stared at the folder, at the evidence of a war being waged in shadows. And he realized with a cold, creeping certainty that he'd walked into something far more dangerous than he'd imagined. Greg stayed through the evening. They talked strategy, combed through documents, built a timeline. The twins came down for dinner, takeout, simple and easy, and the four of them sat around the table in an awkward, tentative silence. Savannah asked him about his work. Sienna said almost nothing, but they were there, and that was something. By the time Greg left, it was nearly midnight. Danielle walked him to the door, her arms crossed against the cool night air. Be careful, she said. If Richard suspects you know something, I'll handle it, Greg said. Danielle studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good night, Greg. Good night. He walked to his car, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes. He didn't look back. Danielle locked the door behind him and moved through the house, checking windows, setting the alarm. The girls were already upstairs. The house was quiet. She walked into the kitchen to turn off the lights, and stopped. On the counter, where nothing had been an hour before, sat a photograph. It was recent, taken from across the street maybe earlier that day. It showed Sienna and Savannah getting out of Danielle's car in the driveway, and scrawled across the bottom in red ink were 4 words. We know where they are. Danielle's hands trembled as she picked up the photo. Her breath came shallow and fast. Someone had been inside. While they were here, while Greg was here. She pulled out her phone, fingers shaking, and dialed. Greg answered on the first ring. They were in my house, she said, her voice tight. Tonight, while you were here, they left a picture of the girls. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Greg's voice, low and deadly calm. Pack a bag. You and the girls. You're not staying there tonight. Greg, I'm turning around. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't argue. The line went dead. Danielle stared at the photo, her heart pounding. This wasn't a warning anymore, it was a countdown. The safe house was a penthouse suite in one of Greg's downtown properties. 42 floors up, private elevator access, security on every entry point. It wasn't home, but it was fortified. Danielle had packed quickly, moving with the kind of efficiency that came from years of single parenting and making hard decisions fast. The girls had followed without protest, though Sienna's silence felt more like controlled anger than compliance. By the time they arrived, it was past 1 a.m. Greg had already arranged for his head of security, a former Secret Service agent named Marcus Chen, to sweep the suite and post guards on the floor. No one was getting in. No one was getting close. Danielle took the main bedroom. The twins shared the second. Greg took the couch. No one slept much. Morning came pale and gray through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a city waking up without them. Greg stood in the kitchen, making coffee he didn't know if anyone would drink. He heard movement behind him and turned to find Savannah standing in the doorway, still in pajama pants and an oversized sweatshirt, her hair pulled into a messy bun. She looked younger like this, less guarded. Morning, Greg said quietly. Morning. She moved toward the counter, eyeing the coffee pot. Is that actual coffee or the fancy kind that tastes like burnt water? Greg almost smiled. Depends on your definition of fancy. If it costs more than $10 a pound, it's fancy. Then it's fancy. Savannah made a face but poured herself a cup anyway, adding enough cream and sugar to kill whatever luxury the beans had promised. She leaned against the counter, watching him with the same measured curiosity she'd shown the day before. "You don't have to do this, you know," she said. "Do what?" "Pretend to be domestic. We know who you are." Greg set his mug down carefully. "And who's that?" "Gregory Whitmore. Media mogul, billionaire. The guy whose name is on half the buildings in Miami." She took a sip, her gaze never leaving his. "The guy who signed divorce papers and never looked back." Her tone wasn't cruel, just factual, like she was reciting information from a Wikipedia page. Greg didn't flinch. "Your mother told you." "She didn't have to. Google did." Savannah shrugged. "We looked you up when we were old enough to understand what it meant that you weren't around. Saw the interviews, the profiles, the pictures of you at galas with women who weren't mom." "Savannah, I'm not mad," she interrupted. "I'm just saying, you don't have to pretend you're someone you're not. We've been fine without you." The words stung more than Greg expected, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. "I know," he said quietly. Savannah studied him for a long moment, then nodded, like she'd confirmed something she already suspected. "Did you ever think about it?" she asked. "Having kids?" Greg hesitated. The honest answer felt too heavy for a conversation at 7 in the morning, but she deserved honesty. They both did. "No," he said. "I didn't. I thought it would complicate things, slow me down. And now? Now I wish I'd been wrong." Savannah's expression softened, just slightly. "Yeah. Well, you were." She took her coffee and walked toward the window, leaving Greg alone with the weight of 15 years he couldn't undo. Sienna emerged an hour later, already dressed, her expression as unreadable as it had been since the moment Greg first saw her. She didn't greet him, didn't acknowledge him beyond a glance, just moved through the space like he was furniture, present, but irrelevant. Danielle appeared shortly after, looking tired, but composed. She'd clearly been on the phone already, coordinating something. When she saw Greg, she gave him a small nod. "Marcus says the perimeter is secure. No one's been near the building." "Good," Greg said. "The girls have schoolwork. I'm going to set them up in the den." "I can help." Danielle paused, then nodded. "All right." The day unfolded in strange, stilted intervals. Savannah worked on a history essay at the dining table, occasionally asking Greg questions about business ethics when her research turned to corporate scandals. Sienna sat on the opposite side of the room with headphones on, her laptop open, working through calculus problems and determinedly ignoring everyone. Greg tried to help where he could, brought water, offered snacks, made awkward small talk that Savannah entertained and Sienna deflected. At one point, Savannah asked him about a merger scandal from the early 2000s. "You were involved in that, right?" she asked, scrolling through an article. "Tangentially," Greg said. "I was on the board, didn't run the company. But you knew what they were doing." "I suspected." "Did you say anything?" Greg met her eyes. "No." "Why not?" "Because I thought protecting the business was more important than being right." Savannah considered this. "Do you still think that?" "No." She nodded slowly, then went back to typing. No judgment, no absolution, just acknowledgement. Lunch was takeout again, Thai food that Danielle ordered and no one ate much of. They sat around the table in a silence that felt less hostile than exhausted. Sienna picked at her pad Thai, her gaze distant. "You don't have to stay, you know," she said suddenly, not looking at Greg. "We've gotten this far without you. We'll be fine." "Sienna," Danielle started. "I'm just saying." Sienna's voice was calm, too calm. "He's got his life. We've got ours. Just because some psycho is stalking us doesn't mean we need to play happy family." "I'm not trying to play anything," Greg said quietly. Sienna finally looked at him. Her eyes were sharp, cutting. "Then what are you trying to do?" Greg didn't have an answer. not one that wouldn't sound like a lie. "I'm trying to keep you safe," he said finally. "Why? Guilt?" "Maybe." The honesty seemed to surprise her. She blinked, her expression flickering for just a moment before hardening again. "We don't need your guilt," she said. "We needed a father. There's a difference." She stood and left the table, disappearing into the guest room and closing the door behind her. Danielle sighed. "She doesn't mean—" "Yes, she does," Greg said. "And she's right." Savannah watched him, her expression unreadable. Then she stood, collected the plates, and started cleaning up without a word. That evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Greg found himself wandering the suite, restless. He ended up in the den, where Savannah had left her backpack open on the couch. A folder had spilled out, papers scattered across the cushions. Greg knelt to gather them, and that's when he saw it. A drawing. Old, the edges worn and colors faded. It looked like something from elementary school. Crayon and marker on construction paper. 3 figures stood in front of a house. A woman in the center, tall and smiling. 2 smaller figures on either side holding her hands. And at the top, in a child's uneven handwriting, "Our family, just us 3. Greg stared at the drawing, his throat tightening. They'd made this years ago, when they were small enough to still draw families and believe the world could be simple. And even then, even as children, they'd known. He wasn't part of it. He'd never been part of it. Greg set the drawing down carefully, his hands shaking. Behind him, Danielle's voice was soft. "I should have told you." He turned. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression weary. "Would it have mattered?" Greg asked. Danielle didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "I don't know." Greg looked back at the drawing, at the life he'd missed, at the family that had built itself in his absence and learned to be whole without him. "I want to fix this," he said. "You can't fix 15 years, Greg." "I know." He met her eyes. "But I can try to make sure they have a future. One where they're safe, where they don't have to be afraid." Danielle studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Then let's find out who's doing this," she said, "and end it." Greg folded the drawing carefully and handed it back to her. And for the first time since this all began, he felt something other than regret. He felt resolve. Greg walked into Richard Maddox's office the next morning like nothing had changed. Same confident stride, same easy smile. The kind of performance he'd perfected over 2 decades of boardroom politics and backroom deals. Richard looked up from his desk, his expression warm and open. "Greg, didn't expect to see you today. Thought you were taking personal time." "Changed my mind," Greg said, settling into the leather chair across from him. "Figured we should go over the Singapore contracts before the board meeting." "Smart." Richard leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He looked relaxed, unguarded, the same man Greg had trusted with half his empire. They talked business for 20 minutes, cash flow projections, acquisition targets. Richard was smooth as always, his answers quick and precise, his manner unshakable. But Greg was watching now. Really watching. And he saw the micro pause before Richard answered questions about overseas accounts. The slight shift in posture when Greg mentioned compliance audits. The way his eyes flicked toward his computer screen when offshore holdings came up. Small things, but enough. "By the way," Greg said casually, standing to leave, "I'm doing a deep dive into our Cayman subsidiaries. Just routine due diligence. You have the access codes for MMX Holdings handy?" Richard's smile didn't falter, but something flickered behind his eyes. Just for a second. "MMX? That's dormant. Has been for years." "Probably, but I like to be thorough." "Of course." Richard nodded smoothly. "I'll have my assistant send over the files." "Appreciate it." Greg left the office, his heart pounding. Richard hadn't asked why, hadn't questioned the sudden interest, just deflected and promised files that Greg suspected would never come. Danielle was right. Greg spent the next 4 hours locked in his private office, bypassing his own security protocols to access files Danielle had flagged. What he found made his blood run cold. MMX Holdings wasn't dormant. It was a labyrinth. Shell companies nested inside shell companies, each one linked to offshore accounts in the Caymans, Switzerland, Singapore. Wire transfers moving millions in and out, disguised as consulting fees and operational costs. And buried deeper, payments to entities that didn't exist. Serenity Wellness Clinic, Grand Cayman, $2.3 million transferred over 18 months. Greg searched the name. No website, no business registration, no physical address beyond a P.O. box. Clearwater Recovery Services, Zurich, $1.8 million, same story, no records, no trace. Lighthouse Foundation, Nassau, $4.1 million. They were ghost organizations, fronts, money disappearing into places that existed only on paper, then reappearing in personal accounts tied to aliases Greg didn't recognize but knew, instinctively, belonged to Richard. His partner, his friend, had been siphoning money from their company for years. Quietly, methodically, covering his tracks so well that even Greg, who prided himself on knowing every corner of his empire, had missed it. And the timeline matched exactly what Danielle had shown him. Every withdrawal from her accounts, every legal threat, every surveillance photo. It all started right after Greg had mentioned tightening oversight. Richard wasn't just embezzling, he was protecting himself. And Danielle had gotten too close. Greg's phone buzzed. Danielle's name flashed on the screen. He answered immediately. "Tell me you're at the safe house. I needed to pick up some things from my office." Her voice was tight, controlled, but Greg heard the fear beneath it. "Greg, someone's following me." His stomach dropped. "Where are you?" "Brickell, heading toward the bridge. Black SUV, tinted windows. It's been on me for 10 minutes. Get to a public place, somewhere with cameras." "I'm trying." The line filled with the sudden screech of tires. Danielle's sharp intake of breath. "Danielle, they just cut me off." Her voice was shaking now. "Greg, they're trying to box me in." "Drive. Don't stop. I'm calling Marcus." "I can't, there's another one." Greg was already moving, grabbing his keys, his phone pressed to his ear as he ran for the elevator. "Danielle, stay on the line. Do not hang up." He heard her breathing, hard and fast, the sound of the engine revving, horns blaring. "There's a gap, I'm going for it." More tires, a sickening crunch of metal. "Danielle!" Silence. Then her voice, breathless. I'm okay. I clipped a guardrail. They're gone. They just pulled off." Greg stopped in the middle of the lobby, his heart hammering. "Where are you?" "Side street off Brickell. I'm pulling over." "Stay there. I'm sending Marcus. Don't move until he gets there." "Greg, don't move." He hung up and immediately dialed his head of security, barking orders as he pushed through the glass doors into blinding daylight. They weren't just watching anymore. They were escalating. By the time Marcus brought Danielle back to the penthouse, Greg was pacing like a caged animal. She walked in pale but composed, a scrape on her hand from the guardrail impact, but otherwise unhurt. The twins rushed to her, both of them talking at once, and she held them close, murmuring reassurances. But when her eyes met Greg's across the room, he saw the truth. She was terrified. He waited until the girls were settled in the den before pulling Danielle into the hallway. "You were right," he said, his voice low and hard. "About all of it." Danielle looked up at him, searching his face. "You found something." Richard's been moving money for years. Shell companies, fake charities, offshore accounts. He's stolen millions, and he's been using the company to do it. Greg's jaw tightened. "And the second you got close, he came after you." Danielle exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. I knew it, I just couldn't prove it. Well, now we can. Greg leaned against the wall, running a hand through his hair. But I need to know everything. Every file you have. Every lead you followed. If we're going after him, we do it right. We bury him so deep he never sees daylight again. Danielle nodded. There's more. Things I didn't tell you yet. Like what? She hesitated, then met his eyes. After the divorce, I didn't just disappear. I worked, consulting at first. Then investigative research for NGOs tracking corporate exploitation in the Caribbean. I built a network. Sources. Contacts. She paused. I wasn't looking for Richard, but about 6 months ago his name came up, connected to labor trafficking, offshore detention facilities disguised as rehab clinics. Greg's blood went cold. The clinics in the files. They're not rehab centers, Greg. They're prisons. Private facilities where people disappear, and Richard's been funding them. The air left Greg's lungs. This wasn't just embezzlement. This was something monstrous. Why didn't you go to the authorities? Greg asked. Because I had no proof, just whispers and patterns, and because... She looked away. Because if I came forward and failed, he'd come after the girls. So I waited, gathered evidence, and when I had enough, I was going to burn him. Her eyes met his again. But he found out, and he moved first. Greg stared at her, the full scope of it finally settling over him. Richard wasn't just a thief, he was a predator, and Danielle had been hunting him alone. Not anymore, Greg said quietly. What? You're not doing this alone anymore. He straightened, his expression hard. We take him down together, but we do it my way, legal, airtight. No room for him to slip through. Danielle studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. All right, she said. Together. Greg held out his hand. She took it. And for the first time in 15 years, they were partners again. Not in marriage, in war. They worked through the night. The dining table became a war room. Laptops open, documents spread across every surface, coffee mugs multiplying like evidence of time passing without notice. Danielle sat across from Greg, her fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up files she'd kept hidden for years. There's something else you need to know, she said, not looking up. After the divorce, I didn't just take time off. I disappeared, changed my name, moved to Grand Cayman, started working under an alias. Greg looked up sharply. Why? Because I needed distance, and I needed purpose. She pulled up a file, turned the laptop toward him. I did consulting work for NGOs, corporate accountability, labor rights, tracking exploitation in offshore industries. Greg scanned the screen. Reports, investigations, all signed by someone named Elena Cortez. That's you? Was me, for 3 years. Danielle's expression was calm, but her voice carried weight. I built a network, sources in banking, shipping, private security. I wasn't looking for Richard, but his name kept coming up. Payments to facilities that didn't exist, contracts with companies that had no employees. And then I found the clinics. She pulled up another file. Audio recordings, dozens of them. I recorded conversations with former employees, people who worked at these so-called rehab centers. They told me things, Greg, things that kept me up at night. She clicked play on one file. A man's voice, accented and tired. They bring people in, tell them it's treatment, but you don't leave unless someone pays. And if no one pays, you just stay. Or you disappear. Greg's stomach turned. Danielle stopped the recording. I have hours of this. Testimonies, wire transfer records, shipping manifests. Enough to prove Richard's running a private detention network disguised as healthcare. Why didn't you release it? Greg asked. Because no one would believe me. Danielle met his eyes. I'm a divorced single mother working under a fake name in the Caribbean. Richard Maddox is a billionaire philanthropist with connections in every government from here to Switzerland. Without credibility, without your backing, it's just noise. Greg sat back, the full picture finally snapping into focus. She hadn't called him out of desperation. She'd called him because she'd been building a case for years, and he was the final piece. "You've been planning this," he said quietly. "I've been surviving this," Danielle corrected. "And now we finish it." Over the next 3 days, they worked in careful, calculated moves. Greg used his access to funnel documents to investigative journalists, anonymous tips, encrypted files, breadcrumbs that led back to Richard without exposing their hand. Danielle coordinated with her old network, feeding information to NGOs and watchdog organizations. Slowly, quietly, the walls around Richard Maddox began to close. But they both knew. The moment Richard realized what was happening, he'd strike back. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Greg was in a meeting with his legal team when his phone buzzed. Danielle's name. He answered immediately. "What's wrong?" Her voice was shaking. "They tried to take Sienna. Everything stopped." "What?" "She was leaving piano class. Marcus was with her, but someone, 2 men, maybe 3, they tried to grab her off the sidewalk. Marcus fought them off, but Greg..." Her voice cracked. They knew where she'd be. They knew her schedule. Greg was already moving, shoving past his lawyers, grabbing his jacket. "Where is she now?" "Safe house. Marcus got her out." "But Greg, she's terrified. She won't stop shaking." "I'm on my way." He didn't remember the drive, didn't remember the elevator, just the sound of his own heartbeat, too loud, too fast, drowning out everything else. When he burst through the door of the penthouse, Danielle was on the couch with both girls. Savannah's face was pale, her arms wrapped around her sister. Sienna sat rigid, staring at nothing, her hands clenched in her lap. She looked small, breakable. Greg crossed the room and knelt in front of her. "Sienna." She didn't look at him, just kept staring straight ahead, her breathing shallow. "They came out of nowhere," she whispered. "I didn't even see them until one grabbed my arm. Marcus pulled me back, but..." Her voice broke. "They were going to take me. If Marcus hadn't been there." "But he was," Greg said firmly. "And you're safe now." "Am I?" Sienna finally looked at him, and the fear in her eyes gutted him. "Are any of us?" Greg didn't have an answer, not one that wouldn't be a lie. So instead he did the only thing he could. He pulled her into his arms. Sienna stiffened. For a moment, Greg thought she'd pull away. But then she collapsed against him, her whole body shaking, and he held her the way he should have been holding her for 15 years. "I've got you," he said, his voice rough. "I've got you, and I'm not letting go." Behind them, Savannah started crying. Danielle pulled her close, her own tears falling silently. And Greg, for the first time in his carefully controlled life, broke. Not with anger, not with regret, with love. Fierce and overwhelming and 15 years too late. But here, finally here, within the hour, Greg had mobilized everything. Marcus coordinated a full security lockdown, no one in or out without clearance. The penthouse was swept for surveillance, new phones, new protocols, but it wasn't enough. "We're moving," Greg said. Danielle looked up sharply. "Where?" "I have a property, private island, 40 minutes by helicopter. No one knows about it except my attorney and Marcus. We go there, we stay there, until this is over." "Greg, we can't just..." "Yes, we can." His voice was steel. "Richard just tried to kidnap my daughter. I'm not giving him another chance." Danielle opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Because she saw it, the shift in him. The walls he'd built around himself for decades finally crumbling. He wasn't a tycoon anymore. He was a father, and he was done playing defense. They left that night. The helicopter touched down on a private airstrip, then lifted off into darkness. Below, the lights of Miami glittered like scattered diamonds, beautiful and distant. Inside the cabin, the twins sat across from Greg, both of them silent. Sienna stared out the window. Savannah watched him, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," Greg said quietly. Both girls looked at him. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry you had to grow up without me. I'm sorry that my mistakes put you in danger." His voice didn't waver. "But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Savannah's eyes filled with tears. Sienna's jaw tightened. "You can't fix this with money," Sienna said. "I know. Or security, or some island hideaway. I know. Then what are you going to do?" Greg met her eyes. "Whatever it takes." For a long moment, Sienna just stared at him. Then, slowly, she nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. The island estate was pristine, white stone and wide windows, hidden among palms and tropical greenery, isolated, secure. Greg stood on the terrace as the sun rose, watching the ocean stretch endlessly before him. Danielle joined him, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. She handed him one. "We're leaking the final files today," she said. "By tonight, every major outlet will have the story. Richard won't be able to stop it." Greg nodded. "And then? Then we wait. Let the world do what we couldn't." "And if he comes after us anyway?" Danielle looked at him, her expression steady. "Then we fight." Greg turned toward the house, where through the windows he could see Sienna and Savannah still sleeping, safe for the first time in weeks. "He's not touching them again?" Greg said quietly. "I don't care what it costs." Danielle didn't argue, because she knew just as well as he did that some things were worth burning empires for, and their daughters were everything. The press conference was scheduled for noon. By 11:30, the lobby of Whitmore Tower was packed with reporters, cameras, and the kind of hungry energy that came when empires were about to fall. They didn't know what Greg was announcing, just that it was urgent, unscheduled, and that Gregory Whitmore himself, a man who rarely gave interviews and never explained himself, had called them here. Greg stood in the green room, adjusting his tie with hands that were steadier than they should have been. Danielle appeared in the doorway. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back. No jewelry except the thin gold bracelet she always wore. She looked calm, composed. But Greg saw the tension in her shoulders. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "Yes, I do. You'll lose everything. The company, your reputation. Richard has lawyers, Greg, connections. This could destroy you." Greg turned to face her. "Good." She blinked. "I built an empire on certainty," Greg said. "On control. On believing that success meant never looking back." He stepped closer. "But the only thing I ever had worth keeping I signed away 15 years ago. So if I have to burn everything else to protect what matters now, then let it burn." Danielle's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "They're here," she said softly. "The girls, they wanted to come." Greg's breath caught. "Why?" "Because you asked them to." She paused. "And because they're braver than either of us." The room fell silent when Greg stepped onto the platform. Every camera turned toward him. Every reporter leaned forward. This was Gregory Whitmore, media mogul, billionaire, the man whose name was synonymous with power in 3 states, and he looked like he was about to tear it all down. Behind him, Danielle took her place to his left. No fanfare, no introduction, just presence. And on his right, Sienna and Savannah stood side by side, identical in their composure, their hands clasped in front of them. They didn't smile, didn't wave, just stood there, steady and unflinching. Greg looked out at the sea of faces and microphones and cameras broadcasting live to millions, and for the first time in his career he didn't have a script. He just had the truth. "My name is Gregory Whitmore," he began, his voice steady. "And I'm here to tell you that I've spent the last 20 years building a company on lies." The room erupted. Questions shouted over one another, cameras flashing. But Greg raised a hand and the chaos stilled. For 2 decades, I trusted my business partner, Richard Maddox, with half of everything I built. I believed he shared my vision, my values, my commitment to integrity. Greg's jaw tightened. I was wrong. He nodded to his attorney, who began distributing folders to the front row. Documents, wire transfers, recorded testimonies. What you're receiving is evidence of systematic fraud, embezzlement, and human trafficking, Greg said. Richard Maddox has been using Whitmore Maddox Enterprises to fund private detention facilities disguised as rehabilitation centers. He's moved hundreds of millions of dollars through shell companies, and he's done it all under the cover of philanthropy and partnership. The room exploded again, reporters on their phones, cameras swinging toward the evidence being passed around. Greg waited. Let them process. Let the weight of it settle. I didn't know, he said, his voice cutting through the noise. But ignorance isn't innocence. I should have looked harder, asked more questions, cared more about what was happening in the shadows of my own company. He paused. I didn't, and people suffered because of it. A reporter shouted from the back, "Are you saying you're complicit?" "I'm saying I'm responsible." Greg's eyes were hard. "And I'm saying it ends today. Effective immediately, I'm freezing all operations tied to Maddox subsidiaries. I'm cooperating fully with federal investigators, and I'm stepping down as CEO until this is resolved." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Gregory Whitmore stepping down was unthinkable. His company was his identity, or it had been. "I've spent my life building towers," Greg said quietly. "Empires, legacies, but I missed the only thing that mattered." He glanced to his right. "I have 2 daughters, Sienna and Savannah. They're 15 years old, and until 2 weeks ago, I didn't know they existed." The room went dead silent. Every camera turned toward the twins. Sienna's expression didn't change. Savannah's chin lifted slightly, but she didn't flinch. "I wasn't there when they were born," Greg continued, his voice rougher now. "I wasn't there for their first words, their first steps, their first days of school. I wasn't there because I was too busy building something I thought was more important." He looked directly into the camera. "I was wrong, and I can't get those years back. But I can make sure that the man who threatened them, who tried to hurt them because they got in his way, never hurts anyone again." His voice hardened. Richard Maddox tried to silence the woman who uncovered his crimes. He stalked her, harassed her, and when that didn't work, he went after my daughters. Greg's hands gripped the podium. "So I'm not just here to expose him. I'm here to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of monster he is." He straightened. "I don't expect forgiveness, not from the people he hurt, not from the partners I've failed, and not from my daughters." He glanced at Sienna and Savannah again. "But I'm done pretending that power and success mean anything without the people you love." A reporter called out, "What do you say to critics who will claim this is just damage control?" Greg's expression didn't change. "I'd say they're probably right, but I don't care anymore. I'm not here to save my reputation. I'm here to protect my family." He stepped back from the podium. "That's all." The fallout was immediate. By the time they left the building, the story had already gone viral. Maddox Exposed was trending worldwide. Federal investigators issued a statement. Richard's accounts were frozen. Arrest warrants were being prepared. The empire Greg had built for 20 years was imploding in real time, and he felt nothing but relief. They returned to the island that evening, exhausted, but alive. Danielle poured wine. The twins disappeared upstairs. Greg stood on the terrace, watching the sun sink into the ocean, painting the sky in golds and purples. His phone buzzed. A text. From Savannah. "Our recital is tomorrow. 7 p.m., Lincoln Center. Come if you want." Greg stared at the message, his throat tightening. Not "you should come." Not "we need you there." Just, "come if you want." An invitation? Tentative. Fragile. But an invitation nonetheless. He typed back immediately. I'll be there. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, okay. Greg closed his eyes, the phone still in his hand. He'd lost an empire today, but for the first time in 15 years he'd gained something infinitely more valuable. A chance, not at redemption, not yet, but at being present, at showing up, at being the father he should have been all along. Behind him, Danielle stepped onto the terrace. "They're nervous," she said, "about tomorrow." "So am I." She almost smiled. "Good. You should be." Greg looked at her. This woman who'd raised their daughters alone, who'd hunted a monster in silence, who'd called him back from a life that meant nothing without them. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up on me. Even when I gave you every reason to." Danielle studied him for a long moment. Then she stepped closer, just enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I didn't do it for you," she said. "I did it for them." "I know." They stood there in silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Tomorrow, Greg would sit in an audience and watch his daughters perform. He wouldn't be on a stage, wouldn't be in control. He'd just be a father, trying, for the first time, to be enough. Lincoln Center was smaller than Greg expected. Not the venue itself. That was grand, all marble and high ceilings and the kind of old-world elegance that money couldn't quite replicate. But the recital hall was intimate. Maybe 200 seats, arranged in gentle rows that curved toward a modest stage where a single grand piano sat under soft lights. This wasn't a performance for thousands. It was for families, for people who showed up because they loved someone on that stage. Greg slipped into a seat in the back row just as the lights dimmed. He'd dressed carefully, suit, no tie, trying to find the balance between showing respect and not looking like he was attending a board meeting. Danielle had texted him the details that morning along with a single line, "They know you're coming. No pressure, just fact." Now sitting in the dark as the program began, Greg felt his heart hammer in a way that had nothing to do with business deals or press conferences. This was different. This mattered. The recital opened with younger students, tentative scales, careful finger placements, the kind of earnest effort that made parents beam and grandparents tear up. Greg watched politely, but his mind was elsewhere. Somewhere near the stage, Sienna and Savannah were waiting. His daughters. 15 years of recitals he'd missed, birthday parties, school plays, quiet evenings practicing scales while Danielle made dinner. All of it had happened without him, in a life he'd never been part of. And now, he was here, in the back row, holding his breath. When their names were called, Greg's chest tightened. Sienna and Savannah Whitmore, Debussy, Claire de Lune, 4 hands. They walked onto the stage together, poised and graceful in matching black dresses. Sienna's hair was pulled into a neat bun. Savannah's fell in soft waves over her shoulders. They didn't look at the audience, just moved to the piano, settled onto the bench side by side, and waited. For a moment, the room was perfectly still. Then they began to play. Greg had heard Claire de Lune before, at galas, in elevators, background noise in expensive restaurants, but he'd never heard it. Not like this. The melody unfolded slowly, delicate and aching, each note placed with care. Sienna's hands moved across the lower keys, steady and grounding. Savannah took the higher melody, her fingers dancing lightly, weaving in and out of her sister's harmony. They moved together like they'd been doing this their whole lives because they had, without him. Greg's throat tightened. He tried to swallow it down, but the music wouldn't let him. It pulled at something deep and raw, something he'd spent decades burying under work and control, and the belief that feelings were a distraction. But there was no burying this. He watched his daughters play, watched the way Sienna leaned slightly into Savannah during a transition, the way Savannah glanced at her sister before a difficult passage, The silent communication between them that didn't need words. They were a unit, complete, and he was just a man in the back row, trying not to fall apart. The final notes hung in the air, soft and fading, like the last light before dark. Then the room erupted in applause. Greg stood with everyone else, clapping until his hands hurt, his vision blurred. He didn't care who saw, didn't care what it looked like. He was just a father watching his daughters bow, and it was the most important thing he'd ever done. Danielle slipped into the seat beside him as the next performer took the stage. She didn't say anything, just sat there, hands folded in her lap, eyes forward. Greg glanced at her. They were incredible. They are, Danielle said quietly. They sat in silence after that, listening to the rest of the recital without really hearing it. Greg's mind was still on the piano. On the way, Sienna's shoulders had relaxed when the final note faded. On the small smile Savannah had allowed herself as they walked off stage. On the fact that he'd been here to see it. When the recital ended, the audience filtered into the lobby. Parents congratulating their kids, teachers shaking hands, the warm chaos of pride and relief. Greg hung back, unsure where he fit in all of this. Then he saw them. Sienna and Savannah stood near the coat check talking quietly with Danielle. When they saw him, Savannah waved. Sienna's expression didn't change, but she didn't look away either. Greg walked over slowly, like approaching something fragile. "You were amazing," he said. Savannah grinned. "We didn't mess up too bad." "You were perfect." Sienna tilted her head slightly. "We missed a transition in the second movement. I didn't notice." "You wouldn't." But there was no venom in her tone, just fact. Greg nodded, accepting it. They stood there for a moment, the four of them, in the middle of a crowded lobby that felt strangely quiet. Then Sienna turned, reaching for her coat. "Come on, Father," she said without looking back. "We're going to be late for dinner." Greg froze. Father. Not Greg. Not him. Father. Savannah's eyes went wide. Danielle's breath caught. But Sienna just kept walking, pulling on her coat like she hadn't just cracked something open in all of them. Greg looked at Danielle, his throat too tight to speak. She met his eyes, and her expression was steady. Honest. "It's not forgiveness," she said quietly. "Not yet. I know. It's going to take time, maybe years. And it's going to be hard." "I know." Danielle studied him. "So why are you here, Greg?" He didn't hesitate. "Because I'm not here for forgiveness. I'm here for them." He glanced toward the twins already heading for the exit. "For us, however long it takes." Danielle held his gaze for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Then let's go," she said, "before they leave without us." They walked out into the night together. The city stretched around them, lights glittering, traffic humming, the world moving forward like it always did. But for Greg, time felt suspended, caught in the space between what had been and what might still be. Sienna walked ahead, hands in her pockets, her stride confident. Savannah fell into step beside Greg, chattering about the recital, about the piece they were learning next, about everything and nothing. Danielle walked on his other side, silent but present. They weren't holding hands, weren't smiling for cameras, weren't pretending this was anything other than what it was, complicated, fragile, real. But they were together, not a perfect family, not a healed one, but a family nonetheless. As they reached the corner, Sienna glanced back over her shoulder. "You coming or not?" she called. Greg smiled. "Yeah, I'm coming." And for the first time in 15 years, Gregory Whitmore wasn't chasing an empire or a legacy or the next big deal. He was just walking through the city with his daughters and the woman who'd given them to him without asking for anything in return. He'd lost billions in the last week. His company was in ruins. His reputation was shattered, and he'd never felt richer in his life, because some things couldn't be bought. Some things could only be built. One moment at a time, one dinner, one recital, one word, Father. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. And for now, that was enough. They disappeared into the crowded streets, 4 figures among millions, ordinary and unremarkable. But to Greg, they were everything. The empire he'd spent 20 years building had crumbled, and in its place, something far more valuable had begun to grow. A family, imperfect, uncertain, but finally, undeniably real. And this time, he wasn't going to let it go. The end. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.